Good evening, and welcome to this evening's program of Writers Speak. Thank you all for coming. Our guest this evening is Alice Mattison, author of 6 novels, 4 short story collections, and a poetry collection. Mattison's stories, essays, and poems have appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times, Plowshares, The Threepenny Review, Ecotone, and elsewhere, and have been anthologized in the Pushcart Prize, Best American Short Stories, and Penn O. Henry Prize Stories. Alice Mattison has been called a writer's writer, an example of her unique style. The 13 connected short stories comprising In Case We're Separated imitate in prose the 13 stanzas of a double sestina, using repeated words in the changing order prescribed by the sestina pattern. Mattison's most recent novel, When We Argued All Night, was published in June 2012. Author Amy Bloom has said of Alice Mattison, "Some writers see the big picture. Some writers describe the smallest, most telling detail. Alice Mattison does both in When We Argued All Night. Mattison knows secrets and tells the truth. The perfect storyteller." It is my privilege to introduce Alice Mattison.
I'm going to read the opening of When We Argued All Night, which is my new novel, which I think I have to stop calling my new novel. It came out in June, and I think I probably should start calling it my novel rather than my new novel, but I still feel like it's kind of new. It is the story of 2 men. I usually write about women, but this is about 2 men, and there's a woman who comes into it. The daughter of one of them is another main character. But the 2 men that you will hear about at the beginning are Artie Saltzman and Harold Abramovitz. It begins in 1936, during the Depression, when they are 26 years old. And the whole part I will read takes place in 1936, and there's a little bit of it that actually goes back a few years, when remembering when they were 19. But the book itself continues on through their lives and ends in 2004, when they're very old, and is also about Artie's daughter, Brenda. And I think that's all you need to know. This starts at a lake in the Adirondack Mountains in upstate New York. And it starts with singing, but I'm not going to sing, I'm going to talk. I hate to see no conceivable point taking off his shoes here. Here being a splintering wooden step off a small slanted screened porch, rocks and pebbles on the downward slope toward the lake, roots of trees. I hate to see, Artie sang, that evening sun go down. He sat down and took off his shoes anyway. First one, experimentally, wiggling his toes, then the other. He left the shoes on the step. I hate to see his hot, itchy black socks, stuffed them into his shoes, stood up carefully. The rocks hurt Artie Saltzman's feet, but the dirt and pine needles between his toes felt good. He breathed air that didn't smell of city. Halfway to the lake, small, round, ringed by mountains, he stopped, undid his belt buckle, his pants. Was he doing this? Then took off all his clothes, bending awkwardly to get his pants and his shorts past his feet. Artie took off his eyeglasses and rolled up his clothes around them, put a good-sized rock on the bundle. A shiver skidded down his back, his tush. Such a dope. He looked around, but nobody was there except Harold way out in the lake. Who would be there? "We can get in a swim before it's dark," Harold had said. Immediately naked, unexpectedly substantial, he was on his way into the lake before Artie had put down his suitcase and wiggled the cramp out of his fingers. Now Harold swam smoothly from right to left, 20 feet from shore. Though Artie could beat Harold easily at handball or punchball, and less easily at tennis, Artie could not swim. "I love to see," he sang again, tree roots under his arches, pain mixed with pleasure. "That morning sun come up." An old gray wooden boat was tied to the dock, making a rhythmic bump when the water shifted it. He made himself walk all the way into the lake, singing, trying and failing not to stiffen, wince, and hesitate. The water was cold. "St. Louis woman," this he shouted. "Not that cold. With your diamond rings." He splashed into the water. He was wet, naked and wet. Artie Saltzman in the Adirondack Mountains with his friend Harold Abramovitz. They'd met in 3rd grade. They were 26 in 1936. With no girls. No, the girl who came to mind simply didn't count. No money, but a week off and a cabin in the woods that belonged to somebody whom Harold knew. How did he invariably get what he wanted? Artie's daughter, Brenda, born 5 years more or less after this splash, would notice that when her father sang, "I hate to see that evening sun go down," he followed it with a silence, and then, "St. Louis woman with your diamond rings." Brenda couldn't tell whether the lines belonged to one song and what was in his mind between them if they did, or 2 songs that he associated, nor whether the 3rd line he sometimes sang about the morning sun was his own invention. She did not ask. Only in adulthood did she hear the St. Louis blues. The lake was socked in with Christmas trees, now blurred with dusk and Artie's nearsightedness. No other houses that he could see. No beach, just a cleared space, a few tree stumps. Now that he was wet, he stood looking around, scooping water and tossing it at his shoulders, and the lake lapped his waist. Harold doubled back, swimming a different stroke, maybe a side stroke, his face away from Artie, his thick yellow curls dark with water. All at once, Artie was angry that he couldn't swim. Maybe he could swim after all. Maybe desire was enough. He thrust himself forward, whipping his head from one side to the other, his eyes squeezed shut, thrashing his arms and legs. Careful not to go too far, but not careful enough. When he tired and stood, he gulped water, choked, scrambled toward shore. Harold had not seen. They'd taken a bus from the Port Authority, the very building where, on the 10th floor, Artie had clerked ineffectually for the WPA until June, when he'd been laid off. "Shirkers and agitators will be dropped first," Ritter had said, announcing the plan to end 10,000 WPA jobs so soon after the whole program hiring people on home relief got going. The administrator's announcement, of course, led to picketing, seizure of the offices, police, all that fun. But though he was again unemployed, now Artie had time for a week in the mountains, and Harold, who still had a job, had finagled time. Harold had decreed they would buy groceries in Albany, beans and wieners, soup. "You need a biscuits," Artie had added. They'd hitchhiked, long waits, short rides, the rest of the way, standing with their thumbs out, each with a valise and a grocery bag. Now it was starting to get dark, and insects fetched and fussed. Something splashed, far out. Harold lumbered into the shallow water near Artie, his big thighs shoving water, his privates wrinkled with cold. "Let's piss in the lake," he said. As they faced the lake, elegantly pissing side by side, as in a rite that would ensure their safety and prosperity, the purity and health of the issue of their loins, and while Harold reached to shove Artie's shoulder, saying, "Son of a gun," to celebrate their achievement, came the tentative sound of a motor. The cabin was on a twisty driveway, and the sound was nearer than the road. It diminished, then grew stronger. "Jesus Christ Almighty," said Artie, the Jewish atheist, as they heard a car stop just beyond the cabin. He started picking his way toward his clothes, but Harold walked deeper into the lake until the water was up to his chest, and stood with his arms stretched wide, casually scooping water, eyeing the cabin and the dirt driveway behind it, where a black Packard was just visible. The engine ceased, and doors slammed. Voices. 2 young women, one with an orange scarf around her head, appeared at the side of the cabin as Artie yanked at the roll of his clothes and first snatched his glasses out of trouble and onto his nose, then made a quick decision to skip his underwear and tried to thrust his legs into his pants, something difficult to accomplish standing up and with wet legs. Brenda and her younger sister Carol would hear this story many times. "So I'm thinking, who the hell are these dames? Did Harold set this up? And he's out there bouncing up and down in the lake and smiling." "Hello?" Then more loudly, "Hello?" The young woman who'd spoken, the one in the orange headdress, was amused, but also something else. "Excuse me?" Artie at last worked his second leg through his pants until his foot came out the other end. Buckling his belt, he set off toward the women bare-chested, determined to step forcefully, but mincing over rocks and roots. "What are you boys doing here?" said the woman as he approached. She had dark reddish hair under the scarf, which she snatched off, raking her hair straight back from her head with arched, strong fingers, lining it up against its will. She had not said, "What are you doing here, Jew?" but Artie flinched as if she had, as if she'd been close enough to see his circumcision. "What the hell are you talking about?" Artie said. "We have permission from the owner. We were invited." Still in the lake, Harold was now a dark lump, useless. Artie tried to remember the name he'd mentioned. Gus, he said. Gus said we could definitely use the house. "Gus is my father," said the woman, who'd turn out to be Myra, whom Artie would always feel he understood better than Harold did because of the advantage of this conversation while the great Harold Abramovitz, reader of Hawthorne, Emerson, and Henry James, had stranded himself in the lake. Brenda and Carol would ask each time, "How did Harold get out of the water?" But the point was that Artie had to solve the problem himself. It became clear, as he and the young woman yelled, that something about Gus embarrassed her, even if he was her father. Noting discomfort, Artie kept arguing. Nobody in later years could remember more than one significant fact about the friend, Virginia, and they didn't learn it until later. Artie and Myra eventually came to an agreement. After all, there were 2 men and 2 women, young, and among them they had, at least now, a house of sorts and a car. The girls, who even had money, drove off, saying they'd return with steaks and liquor. Artie had declared there was room for all in the cabin, an unlikely idea. When the car was gone, Harold limped, shivering, into the cabin and began scrambling in his suitcase for a towel. "What the hell did Gus tell you?" Artie said. "He said use the cabin any time. So I got him to draw a map." Harold rubbed his legs vigorously, then jerked the towel back and forth across his back. "You didn't tell him we were coming this week?" "I wasn't sure at the time." "You never told him?" Harold shrugged and dried his ears. "He told me where the key was. What the hell difference does it make?" He looked whiny and cold, his blue eyes bulging, his wet curls flat. Artie didn't answer. Harold had found the key readily in a crevice in the cabin's stone foundation, inside a metal box that might have contained candies a long time ago. "I'm hungry. I don't want to wait," Artie said. "Wait for what?" Harold began getting dressed. "Those girls. They're coming back with food." "Why would they do that?" Harold got dressed just so, like a judge putting on his robes. Artie had somehow known this, maybe from Jim in high school. Harold tucked his undershirt into his shorts. He straightened his shirt and smoothed it over his tuchus as he pulled his pants up. He rummaged in his valise for a heavy sweater. The bag mostly had books in it. "I told them they could stay here," Artie said, leaning in the doorway. Given a wall, Artie leaned. "You told them they could stay here? We don't want them to stay here." "Why not? They're pretty. Besides, they need a place to stay, and they thought they were staying here," Artie said. "They don't want to stay here with us," Harold said. "What's wrong with us?" Artie didn't trust Myra exactly, but he liked her scrappiness, her shiksa sense of superiority. Virginia was quiet and pretty, a blonde. "There's no room," said Harold. "They have money. They'll go to a hotel." "There's room. And why should they give it up if it's their place?" The cabin had in it a fireplace, a wood stove, a table, a moldy couch, a sink, pine walls and ceiling, 4 windows, bunk beds in a tiny bedroom. A short distance away, an outhouse. "We're in the wilderness," Artie said. "There's no hotel." "Sure there is," Harold said. "They won't be back. Didn't you say the name Gus before she did?" "She said Gus was her father after you said the owner was Gus." "How did she know Gus was old enough to be her father in that case?" "He isn't." "And how did she know enough to ask us who we were? If she's not Gus's daughter, she knows Gus." But maybe Harold was right. The girl, Myra, could be anyone. She would not return. He was sorry. He was curious. They built a fire, cooked franks on sticks, and heated up beans. As they ate, Artie had an inspiration. He thought for a while, then spoke. There were 2 naked Jews in the mountains who decided to try out their fountains. They pissed in the lake, a colossal mistake. "Yes." Harold chewed, waiting. They sat on spindly red chairs at the little table against the window overlooking the lake, now invisible in the dark. "I thought a last line would come, but it didn't. What rhymes with mountains?" "Accountants." "Forget it." They piled the plates in a dishpan. There was a faucet with a strong rope of cold water, but no reason to clean up. "I'm glad they didn't come back," Harold said. "I need to talk to you." He settled himself on the sofa. "About what?" Artie was on his way to the bedroom. "I want to unpack," he said. He wanted the bottom bunk, and if he didn't move fast, Harold would end up with it. "No, sit down." Artie stood uncertainly, suitcase in hand, then set it down where he stood, pulled one of the wooden chairs closer, and sat down. Can't it wait? We have a week, for God's sake. No, said Harold. Look, I want to tell you first. He stretched his feet out into the room, leaned back, arranged his hands behind his head. Well, I guess it's news. I joined the party. Holy shit. When? The party? What the hell did you do that for? Artie stood, then turned his chair and straddled it, so its back was between him and Harold. He leaned forward on the chair back, familiar rage starting, maybe because Harold had done this without him, maybe because it was, as so often, bigger and braver and more interesting than anything he did, maybe because it was stupid. He had been at Communist Party meetings, sure. They annoyed him. If you said something wrong, you had to pay a fine. How could Harold, of all people, stand that? Mr. Independence, how the hell could you join the party? Even here, even in the wilderness, did they have to talk about the state of the world? It wasn't a momentary decision, Harold said. Momentary decision? When did you ever make a momentary decision? Artie made momentary decisions. Harold never. Just tell me this, he continued. Just for 1 second, tell me this. His skin felt hot. When was it proved that taking forever to make up your mind means you decide right? Would you give me a chance? Harold said. As if I didn't know what you're going to say. The working slobs, the suffering masses. Artie shifted his chair and sat on it the proper way, then shifted it again and sat astride. And you don't care about that? Said Harold, still stretched on the sofa, but now gesturing slowly with his hands, those insufferably calm, wide, pink hands that for all his life Artie would picture when anyone said, about anything whatsoever, just leave it in my hands. What you don't like about the party bothers me too, Harold said. They're bossy. Bossy! Bossy! Artie flung his arms out, reaching toward the walls. Those guys are totalitarian. They're like Franco. Well, I wouldn't go that far, Harold said. The point is, time and again, he erected with his right hand a barrier between one time and another time. And again, he erected a second barrier. The CP has been the only organization to step in. Harold's hand cut through his barrier, and speak up. The same hand came down on the other imaginary barrier, smashed it to bits. Nobody else has the guts. Nobody else has the drive. Harold's blue eyes bulged more than usual. Maybe nobody else cares as much about being the center of attention. The Scottsboro boys, the strikes, I know. They're not perfect. Of course, they want attention. They want members, but we have to choose. We have to make a choice, Artie. Oh, don't give me that. I don't think, Harold stood, that it's truly principled to watch everything that happens and not take a position. Artie stood and picked up his suitcase again. You and your fancy principles. All my life I've been hearing about your principles. He turned his back. Then something occurred to him and he couldn't keep his mouth from smiling. Not just your goddamn principles, your goddamn assistant principles. I'm going to bed. All right, came Harold's voice behind him. Harold's suitcase was already open on the bottom bunk. Some of his clothes and books had been taken out. Son of a gun, said Artie. Son of a gun. Was he surprised? He was not surprised. He opened his suitcase on the floor in front of Harold's bunk, took out his pajamas, and remembered the outhouse. Better to visit it in his clothes, and then figure out how to get into the top bunk. It might be necessary to step on the possessions of the guy in the bottom bunk. Too bad. Do we have a searchlight, he called. No. Harold Abramovitz's father sewed linings into women's jackets. On the streetcar or in the street, he might point and whisper, asking Harold to notice the faulty construction of a woman's coat, how the lining sagged. Pop, Harold would say, for God's sake. You should know. Harold would turn his head, as reluctant to be seen staring at a woman as he was determined not to be instructed about the garment trades when he'd decided to become a philosopher. But even as he shrugged away his father's hand on his shoulder, look, the sleeve, bunched up, there at the shoulder. Never you should do like that. Rip it out. Harold felt guilty because the father's life, how proud he had been when he was promoted to linings, how his eyes hurt at night, moved and troubled the son. His father, a stalwart union member, a socialist, was intelligent. Harold knew that if they hadn't lived in New York, City College was free. He might end up sewing linings, too, if he was good enough. He honored those who labored, whom he pictured with stubby bodies, round haircuts, and billowing pants, like Bruegel's harvesters, and he tried to honor his parents, but he couldn't seem to perceive his parents' nobility as clearly as their foolishness and errors. He didn't want to feel superior to people who worked with their hands, but he did feel superior. Nights he enumerated in his mind his rude remarks and instances of disrespect, but the next day he was again rude and disrespectful. Then his friend Artie, this was when they were in high school, somehow acquired a used camera. He loved photographing Harold's father, who had sad eyes and a wide, bare forehead. Artie showed up at their apartment on weekends, slouching in doorways and declining Harold's mother's offers of seltzer or a sandwich until he had the nerve to ask Mr. Abramovitz to move closer to the window. Harold's father was unself-conscious and posed without altering his expression, as patient as if all the history of Eastern Europe resided in his body. After high school, Artie took business classes at night and worked in a camera store, getting in trouble for telling customers more than they wanted to know. Harold studied English literature at City College's main branch uptown. English turned out to consist of what he'd imagined philosophy to be. He made only a little money, delivering parcels for a drugstore, but his parents believed their only child would distinguish himself. Reading Wordsworth's Michael, about a shepherd whose son runs off to the wicked city and never returns to help his father finish the sheepfold they had been wholesomely building together, Harold felt guilty. But by this time, he'd learned to enjoy feeling guilty, and he envied the great Catholic saints their excruciating and yet welcome sense of sin. The depression began during Harold's junior year in college. Artie lost his job and began taking pictures of labor union meetings and political rallies, occasionally selling photographs to a newspaper. One or another of his brothers always had a job, so his family had food. The first time Harold went with Artie to a political rally, he was doing his friend a favor by keeping him company, but he got interested. The rhetoric made sense. It had the right mixture of the abstract and the specific for Harold's taste. He liked hearing that all who labored were equal, were comrades. It was what he had tried and failed to believe before, but put this way, it was easy to take into his head and expound sincerely. He was not being asked simply to feel bad that he didn't work with his hands and didn't want to. He could look forward to a future in which those who did that labor were not deprived of their dignity or of just compensation. Artie stumbled from the back door to the outhouse by means of the light from the cabin. On his way back, he heard something familiar, that car again. At least this time he wasn't naked. "Hungry?" Myra said as she came in. The scarf was gone, and her hair tumbled about her face. "Thirsty?" She was smiling, but she looked worn out, exasperated. Harold had stood to meet them. "We thought you weren't coming." "Don't tell me you ate," Myra said. "Never mind, you're eating again." "Fine," Harold said. "We didn't have much of a dinner. I'm Harold Abramovitz." Virginia smiled blandly. Maybe, Artie decided, coming up next to Harold. She was slow. "What took you so long?" he said. "Where were you?" "He wants to know where we were," Virginia said to Myra, shrugging in Artie's direction. "So I hear," Myra said. "We had to go all the way to Lake George." "You know your way around," Harold said. Artie had no idea how far away Lake George was. Far. Harold, who seemed to have changed his mind about the desirability of visitors, made gestures suggesting hospitality. "I guess you could say that," Virginia said. "I guess you could say we know our way around, right, My?" Then she laughed. "The truth is, we got lost." Ignoring her, Myra unpacked a paper bag, 4 steaks, a loaf of bread, and a bottle of bourbon. "You provide the vegetables," she said, "if you want a vegetable." "And where's the fire? You should have had a fire ready." "She's cranky when she's hungry," Virginia said. Then she added, "Well, that sounds nice," which made Artie realize he had begun to whistle, which meant he was feeling unsure of himself. Beethoven. Harold and Myra got the fire going again. Myra yanked open a drawer, took out a knife, and began trimming the steaks. "You knew where the knife was," Harold said. "I remembered," said Myra. She didn't just glance at him over her shoulder. She turned so that their shoulders were facing, as if she were playing tennis with him. "It's true you've been here before. I told your suspicious pal. Gus is my daddy." "Gus never mentioned you," Harold said, and Myra looked at him sharply. Virginia giggled again. "Her sugar daddy, more like," she said. Harold looked from one to the other of them, startled. He looked at Artie, as if to explain the quick look. "I've met his wife. I've seen his kids." Artie couldn't help it. "Isn't monogamy a bourgeois capitalist idea it's high time we threw out?" he said. with more nastiness in his voice than he had expected. "You can't make an omelet without breaking eggs. Isn't that how you fellas put it? Break up some marriages, too." Harold was silent, eyeing the steaks, which Myra now laid across the grate, her back to Artie. Then he said in a low voice, "Gus isn't in the party." "I didn't say he was," Artie continued, the roughness and loudness of his voice still surprising him. "I'm talking about your principals, your goddamn principals, and your goddamn—" He stopped. The assistant principal's joke was not funny enough to repeat. Myra scurried around, elaborately hearing nothing, and found jelly glasses, into which she put generous servings of bourbon and water. They ate the steaks rare. Those frankfurters certainly hadn't been enough. Before the food was quite gone, Harold stood. "We're giving you girls the bunk beds," he said. Artie was partly relieved, partly annoyed. He'd have tried a little something with Virginia, he now decided, if he'd had the chance. Just enough friendliness to make it possible to share a bunk end to end. But now the girls brought in a couple of bags and shrieked their way to the outhouse, then waved goodnight and went into the bedroom. Harold gave Artie the sofa, insisting he didn't mind sleeping on the floor. He'd found some blankets. The sofa was bad enough. In his clothes, his pants unbuttoned for comfort, Artie lay down and closed his eyes. His shoulder was cramped. He sensed Harold's wakefulness on the floor below him. At last he began to sing. 149 is the school for me, drives away all adversity, steady and true will be to you, loyal all to 149, rah, rah, rah. Harold listened silently. As kids, they'd both gone to PS 149 in East New York, but as Harold often pointed out, they weren't kids anymore. Eventually, his deeper voice joined Artie's. "Raise on high the red and white, cheer it with all your might. Good old 149, hurrah for 149, rah, rah, rah." They fell silent, Harold before the last syllables. Some time later, knowing they were both still awake, Artie thought again of his limerick. "At a mountain lake, as day was dimming, two bare-ass Jews thought they'd go swimming. Then they pissed in the lake, a colossal mistake, for a shark came and gave them a trimming." "A new low, even for you," Harold said. On a chilly March afternoon in 1930, when they were 19, Harold had skipped a class he considered pointless. The professor's ideas about poetry were jejune, to go with Artie to Union Square so Artie could photograph a communist rally on unemployment. Artie liked photographing excited, angry people, and he told himself that one of these days he'd produce a photograph of an important event so impressive that a newspaper would not only buy it but put him on staff. At the rally, the crowd was larger than they'd seen before. Artie and Harold leaned on a tree, not far from the speakers, but off to the side. More people arrived, and now they were in the middle of the crowd. "Would you look at those cops?" Artie said. "Jesus Christ!" He took off his glasses and replaced them, then slapped his head, a habit. He had lank black hair that looked untidy the week after a haircut. Then Artie began slapping his own leg, rhythmically, and Harold knew something was going to happen. The speakers began urging the assemblage to march on City Hall and demand to see Mayor Walker. Whistling, Artie went to photograph the nervous cops who massed near the front of the crowd, and Harold watched him make his way through the throng and slip sideways up to them, crouch to get the angle he wanted, and shoot. Nobody seemed to notice. Since their childhood, Artie had known how to deny his presence with his slouch and shrug, his skinniness, the flat hair on his narrow skull, as if he was invisible, or the color of leaves and shadows. Harold knew that he himself gave just the opposite impression. Strangers in the street sometimes seemed confused, as if they thought he was approaching them specifically. In school, teachers called on him when he hadn't raised his hand, or they looked at him expectantly. "Question, Mr. Abramovitz?" a professor might say, though Harold was just listening. Artie returned. He said, "They've got people from City Hall up there, maybe the chief of police." He moved away again into the crowd. Harold watched 3 women near him, cheering lustily, then laughing as if they were pleased simply to be making this noise. The next time he saw Artie, he was photographing 3 men who looked confused, maybe arguing about whether to stay or leave. Artie seemed interested in the trees near these men, maybe the look of the ridged bark with these gesturing arms and open mouths superimposed on it. The mood of the crowd changed. The leaders asked everyone to march to City Hall, and there were cheers. Harold was afraid, but he wanted to march. He was tired of being an observer. There was sudden movement, shouting. The police were charging, and some of the crowd surged against them while others tried to run away. All at once it was impossible to go in any direction, and Harold saw a man knocked down by a policeman's baton. Others tried to help him or keep from stepping on him, and batons hit them. Harold, shocked, found himself walking toward the police, inserting himself between people, as if he had business in that direction. Right in front of him, a cop kicked a young woman in a long, dark coat. She seemed stunned. Given no time for thought or fear, Harold reached his arms and big hands toward the woman, seized her by the shoulder, unceremoniously pulled her to his chest, then pulled her behind him as the cop charged. To his own astonishment, Harold waved his arms in the air, his hands gyrating of their own accord, and he began to scream and shriek, high-pitched oohs and ahs he had never heard himself emit before. The policeman swatted at his hands with his stick, and Harold felt a strange pain outline his right hand and arm. Behind him, the woman cursed the cop. Putting one hand on Harold's arm for support, she hiked up her skirt and kicked the policeman. She kicked again, and he staggered backward. Harold pushed her ahead of him into a space in the crowd. Soon they were crying and shuffling, holding hands. The part of the crowd they were in was not trying to make its way south toward City Hall, but east along 15th Street. He and the woman came to a street in which the crowd was sparse enough that they could set their own pace. Her hat was gone, and her hair blew over her face. His overcoat was open and torn, and his face was covered with mucus. He was crying. He touched his cheek and felt blood. They stopped, became self-conscious, looked at each other, and stopped holding hands. The woman said, "How old are you?" At the time it seemed like a natural question. 19, said Harold. How old are you? 27, said the woman. Are you from the Bronx? Brooklyn. Now they were turning aside to part, but Harold didn't want to. He was sick with fear for Artie, but curious about this woman who had touched him so intimately. Wait, he said. My name is Harold Abramovitz. Bell Cantor. Do you have paper? I'll give you the address where we meet. He had a squashed notebook in his pocket, a pen. And there I will stop. Thanks. Thank you. Thank you. I'm told that you might like to ask questions. Yes.
I was wondering how you approach research when you're working on a novel that spans
Yeah.
so much time.
Yeah.
If you could tell us.
I do a lot of research. This has changed with the web. I mean, I used to go to the library and they had these immense indexes of the New York Times, and I would look in the indexes of the New York Times and find stories, and then I would read them in microfilm. Essentially, I still do the same thing. I mean, I do read some books, but mostly I work in old issues of the New York Times. I'm absolutely fascinated by old newspapers. I mean, I don't know if you have ever done this, but if you haven't, you owe it to yourself to, you know, I know most or all of you are writers, to write something that requires that you go and do this, because there is nothing quite so amazing as reading newspaper stories that were going on when the people didn't know what would happen next. You know, are we going to get into World War II or not? Maybe, probably not. You know, and, whatever is going to happen, and you know it, and they don't. And so I have been drawn more and more toward reading old newspaper stories and learning about what the characters would have known about at the time. And a lot of that came into this. But that's what I do. Now I do it on my own computer because, you know, if you have access to a database that has historical New York Times, then you can do that. Yes?
So a related question. I'm curious about the dialogue. I didn't realize this when I was reading it, but listening to you, the dialogue is really sort of ageless, and it's very careful. And your character, I mean, you're speaking, 80 years ago, and it seems right, but you didn't. There's no. I'm curious about how you think about the dialogue.
Well, my parents were young during that time, and my aunts and uncles and so on. And so I grew up hearing that speech, that New York speech of the 30s. So it is still, you know, I'm sure all of you, wherever you grew up or whoever you grew up with, you know that speech and you recognize it when you hear it. So I'm trying to listen and not get things wrong, because I'm writing about 80 years ago, and I hope I didn't. But of course you can't be sure.
No, but you didn't use any dialect, like decade-bound dialect.
Well, there are words. I mean, I think they say things. I don't think people say "son of a gun" anymore.
Right.
Did anybody say "son of a gun"? Is that, that's something I grew up hearing. Yeah, they call a suitcase a valise at least some of the time. I mean, I tried to, and of course, reading old stories and old books helps you. You kind of, oh right, that's what they did. Some of it I just remembered. My father used to say a searchlight, and I don't know if that was just my father or whether other people said flashlight. I grew up hearing searchlight from him. I called it a flashlight, but he called it a searchlight. So I have already say, do we have a searchlight? Yeah. Yes.
Just a comment. I love the way you packed so much information into each line of description and each line of dialogue. There was no wasted space, so that this specific image was created and carried through, like on its own speed, like a train just going along.
Thank you.
You used it. You used every line in such a wonderfully specific way. There was no chance to nod off or become vague or no niceties. So to say that writers can film it.
Thank you. I cross out a lot.
You can tell.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of my revision is realizing that I don't need the character to say, now that we're here, I think we should do this. Just have, look, I leave that line, you're here. Just, I think, I think we all do that. You kind of write, especially dialogue, you write it the way people would actually say it. And of course we say all kinds of extra words when we're talking. And then you go back and you compress it into something that is actually not realistic, but seems more realistic.
Can I follow up with that? Because I
Sure.
confess I haven't read any of your previous work. So is that something you developed really with this work, specifically more so than before?
No, I've always, somewhere along the line, I understood that realistic dialogue is actually shorter. What will work on the page is more compressed than what people will actually say.
But you say so much in the shoot. I mean, you give such a specific piece of information about the character.
Well, I figure my reader has a lot to do, and I don't want to waste his or her time.
So have these characters appeared
These characters, no.
prior to this? I mean, have you built a relationship with them so that
No.
you know these people inside out?
Yeah, I have done that. Kind of used somebody from that book in another book, but no, these people were new for this book.
And where did they appear in your imagination, or how did they manifest themselves? Or do you remember when they suddenly sort of manifested themselves and you said, "Oh my goodness, I have a book here"?
Well, I wrote an earlier novel. My second novel had to do with a similar subject matter. It's about lefties in the 30s and someone who loses his job as a New York City school teacher in the 1950s during McCarthyism, which was something I knew about. I knew about, as we all know about this, that when Senator McCarthy was at his height, there were anti-communist investigations all over the place, and all kinds of people in Hollywood, people were blacklisted, and a lot of people lost their jobs because they had some kind of left-wing identification. Either they had been members of the Communist Party or not even, but just they knew communists, so they weren't able to say anything. And so they didn't want to name names, so they didn't say anything, so they lost their jobs. And I actually knew somebody when I was a child who lost his job at that time. So I wanted to write a book about it, and I did. My second novel, which is called Hilda and Pearl, is about a man who loses his job in the 50s during the McCarthy era. But I did that whole part from the viewpoint of his daughter, of a little child. I didn't have the nerve to write from the point of view of an adult man, you know, in 1950 losing his job. I was not ready to do that. And then I don't regret that book. I think it's good, but I regretted not having the courage to write from the viewpoint of the people involved. And so for years after that, I wanted to write another book about lefties in the 30s who come up against the McCarthy era in the 50s, and that's this book. So I knew I was going to do it for a long time, but it seemed scary because it was going to be such a long stretch. And that one is it's kind of structured differently. It's easier. This was going to be hard, and so I kept postponing it and writing other books instead. So it was there waiting for me, and then I finally did it. But a lot of the fun of it was saying, okay, I'm gonna be Artie and Harold. I'm not gonna just be a woman or a child knowing Artie and Harold. I'm gonna be them. I'm gonna enter them. Was there a question over here? Yes, sorry.
Excuse me. I get the subject matter and how it carries over in the historical research work. But what was uncanny to me was the way that as a writer who's written from a female perspective and about female characters, captured what it's like to have male relationships, because that was just uncanny in the way that they related to each other and the way they related to being displaced in the Adirondacks and their background and the different way they responded to women and so forth. That was very spot on from my experience of male relationships. That was really spot on. So how did you inhabit that part? Was that from your father's relationships, other parts?
No.
Did you handle it that way?
I don't know. You know, I think it's easier than it used to be. I mean, a famous thing about Jane Austen is that there is no scene in Jane Austen in which men are alone. Because she'd never been there. You know, she'd never been in a situation where men were alone, and she has lots of men, but she doesn't attempt a situation with just men. I mean, some of it is just chutzpah. You know, I just did it. It turns out that the police don't come and carry you away if you try writing something that you don't really feel, you know, qualified to write. But some of it, I think, is that in our era, it is, of course, I still have never been in a situation where men are alone, but almost. I mean, I remember one day being on a bus and overhearing two men having a conversation. And of course, that happens all the time. You hear men having a conversation. And of course, those men knew they weren't in private. But at the same time, I think we all hear more in this looser era and in this era of cities and restaurants and coffee shops, and where you get a lot of unguarded moments. And if you're nosy enough, you can get a sense of what it's like. I mean, like if you watch two people of the opposite sex from yourself, you know, if you don't know them, you look at them and you can tell whether are they comfortable together or are they tense? Are they, you know, which one really wants to leave and which one wants to stay? You know that. You can look at them and see it. And so after a while, you can know a lot about them.
I just would say that whether it was chutzpah or whatever it was, I think you captured
Most
it
of it.
brilliantly.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Because just even not the relationship parts, but just their own internal monologue when they're thinking about things as they experience things was just very much my experience of how that works. And I thought it was brilliant.
That's great.
Really,
Thank you.
really great.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Yes.
I'd like to ask you about the short story book and
Uh-huh.
how you came, that I referred to that in case we're separated.
Yes.
How you came upon that structure and the images
Yeah.
that you used.
Yeah. Yes, I decided to write a book of connected short stories, and in my mind it was going to be more autobiographical than my other work, which my work is very not autobiographical. It's kind of about people like the people I grew up with, but not them in particular. And so I thought this one would be more, although it isn't, as it turns out. And I think because that made me feel shy, I needed to do something to distance that. And I was writing about the family that I had when I was a college student. I went to Queens College, so lived at home and commuted to college, and was part of a large Jewish extended family of immigrants and their children, into early adulthood, where I might have been in a dorm. I was not. I was in these kitchens. And so this book really came out of that. And I wanted to, in some way, capture the divided sense I had going to college and learning about medieval literature and sestinas and villanelles and all that kind of stuff. And it's kind of have it in the book. So I decided, you know what a sestina is, everybody? Eh? It's a poem that uses 6 words over and over and over again. So, and in a certain pattern. So like if the words are, head, foot, chair, microphone, ceiling, shoe, then, head, foot, it's like, it's the last word of each line. And then in the next stanza, you use the same ones and so on. So I decided I would pick 6 things, 6 tropes that I would use over and over again. And I did. In each story, there's like a glass of water, there's a map that might be wrong. So each story has that, and they have them in the order in which a sestina would have them. I think I did it because I thought it would be fun. And it was, and it turned out to be easier to write, not harder, which is advice I can give you, that if you make up a game like that, it does make it easier. If you say, I am stuck in the scene of my story, and what I'm going to do is open the dictionary at random, and the first noun I put my finger on is going to appear in that scene. You'd think it would be impossible to write it, but it won't. It'll be easier. So that's kind of what I did. I knew I had to have a glass of water in the next bit, or I knew I had to have a map in the next bit. Well, I think I'm starting to ramble, so I will stop. Thank you so much. It's really been a pleasure to know you and meet you.